Welcome to the Prospective Doctor Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Today I have Ken Tao on the line. Ken is our lead expert in MCAT tutoring, and he's actually leading up the MCAT tutoring division at Med School Coach. And today I wanted to sit down with Ken and talk a little bit about the MCAT in general. So hopefully this will be very informative for those who are considering taking MCAT and planning your tests in the future. Hi, Ken. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So Ken, let's just start out. Can you provide an overview of the test? What is it? How long is it? What can somebody just getting to know the MCAT expect of this test?
Yeah, so to begin, the MCAT exam, it stands for the Medical College Admission Test. And this is the exam that pre-medical students that want to attend the majority of medical schools within the United States and Canada, this is the exam that they would have to take. And the exam has 4 sections. Each section has a very long name. The first is the Chemical and Physical Foundations of Biological Systems. This section covers a broad range of topics, including general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, and biochemistry. The second section is the CARS section, and that stands for the Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills. This is what most people would consider the verbal reasoning section of the exam, and it's pretty typical of all standardized exams out there. The third section is the Biochem section, and its complete name is the Biological and Biochemical Foundations of Living Systems. And this section is really packed with a lot of biology, biochemistry, and it also has a little bit of general chemistry and organic chemistry. And the last section, which is really the newest section on the exam, is the Psychological, Social, and Biological Foundations of Behavior. And this section covers mostly psychology and sociology and a little tiny bit of biology.
Great. That's a lot of information. And I know that since the time I took the exam, I think it was 2008. It has changed substantially. I think when I took the exam, it was about 6 hours long. How long is the test now, Ken?
Yeah, so the exam has certainly went through a lot of changes since you've taken the exam. And right now it's in quite a long form that the 3 science sections are 95 minutes each, and the CARS section is 90 minutes. So in terms of test taking time, you've got about 315 minutes worth of test taking time. And if you were to go ahead and include all of the breaks in there, which also includes a 30-minute lunch break, ends up being about 7.5 hours long.
Wow, yeah, it's definitely a long test, but something good to start preparing applicants for the long tests that are required in their medical school journey, that's for sure. Can you tell us a little bit about the scoring? I know that is something that is changed in 2015 that most people are getting used to, but maybe you could just clarify how the test is scored a bit.
Yeah, of course. So the scoring system actually hasn't changed too much from the old exam, which, these days people are talking about less and less since it's now been a few years since the exam has changed. The old exam, the scoring system for each section was between 1 to 15. So 1 being the lowest score, 15 being the highest score. Now, with the new exam, it's still on a 15-point scale. It's just that they added 117 to each section. So what that means is that the lowest possible score on each section is 118 and the highest possible score is 132. But that's still a 15-point scale within that range. And similar to the old exam, right in the middle, right in the middle of those numbers is 125. That is the average for each section of the exam. So it actually makes it easier or fairly easy to look at a student's score and tell whether they're above average or below average, since average score in all 4 sections would be a perfect 500.
Great, yeah. How long do you usually suggest that somebody studies for the MCAT?
This is a really tricky question because it often ends up depending on the student's specific situation, whether the student is going to be taking the MCAT in their sophomore year, junior year, senior year, or this is a student that has graduated or, has many years between their college degree and when they decide to actually pursue medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's a particular situation that you wanted to start with, perhaps.
Let's just say the typical applicant who will be applying their junior year of college, the really traditional applicants. So they'll be applying sometime in May or June of their junior year to matriculate once they graduate in the fall of their senior year, or after their senior year, rather.
Okay, yeah. So for these students, it actually is getting more difficult with them just because the exam is really just adding more and more content that students need to know. So for these students, a very important thing for them to try to do is try to plan out their coursework ahead of time, because one of the courses that is hard for students to take early in order to apply summer after their junior year is biochemistry. And not just because for a lot of schools, you have to take biochemistry after you've taken all these other prereqs for biology, general chemistry, organic chemistry, and so forth. And it really is important to take that course because biochemistry is 25% of two sections of the exam, the chem phys and the biochem section. And there's actually more biochemistry questions than there are general chemistry, organic chemistry, and physics.
Wow.
So I would say if you have a student who is able to take all of their MCAT prerequisite courses, including biochemistry, before the exam, then they would be more or less the typical student, where if they can find about 300 hours or so of studying time, and that can be, broken down into a summer of studying about full time or spread out throughout an entire semester, that would work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And usually when I work with applicants, I really try to suggest that they use their breaks as much as possible. Like I think studying over, usually most schools give students about 4 weeks off during winter break. That's a great time to start studying for the MCAT. Or even after they graduate or after their semester is done in May, let's say they end in early May, maybe taking it at the very end of May is good as well, so that they could have a few just solid weeks of exclusive MCAT studying, which I think is pretty essential. Would you agree with that, Ken?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are definitely some of the most popular MCAT test dates, particularly in January, right after the winter break you just described. And also, of course, summer, when a lot of students tend to have a lot more spare time.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And I know for me personally too, I definitely needed that kind of just time where I had no courses and I could just solely dedicate my studying to the MCAT. Because although you're taking courses that the material is reflective of what's going to be tested on the MCAT, you really need to sit down and go through MCAT review books, go through practice questions that are just outside of your courses to help prepare you for this test. What type of score should somebody be aiming for? I know that you mentioned a 500 is the average, and somebody may say, well, I want to score somewhere around the average because, that sounds good, right? But is a 500 really what most people should be aiming for?
Yeah. So if you think about the number of people who take the MCAT exam, it's actually quite a large number. And certainly not everyone who takes the MCAT is ultimately going to be able to get into medical school. So 500 in most cases is going to be pretty tough to get into medical school. It doesn't mean that it's not possible, but it wouldn't be what many people would consider a competitive score. Mm-hmm. So the best way to consider a competitive score is just to look at the data from the AAMC about applicants and matriculant data for previous years. So I can say, for instance, in the 2016 to 2017 application cycle, 53,000 people applied, and that average MCAT score was 501.8. But again, that's not for people who actually got in, the matriculants. The matriculants, which was 21,030 students, had an average total MCAT score of 508.7. But another important thing to note is that the competitive MCAT score has always been rising steadily over the years for both the old exam and the current exam. So right now, the data for the most recent cycle, the 2017 to 2018 cycle, is out, and that average MCAT score is a 510.4, for matriculants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great point to make. I mean, the one thing to really consider too is what a stark difference there is between the average MCAT for applicants and the average MCAT for matriculants. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at the numbers that to really be competitive to get an actual admission to medical school, you need a pretty significantly higher MCAT score than the average applicant. And even just looking at those numbers, you're looking at about a 40% acceptance rate. So things like a high MCAT score can really distinguish your application from other applicants just to increase your chances for an acceptance. Ken, what do you suggest is the best route for people to study? And obviously, this is a little individualized for a lot of applicants because everybody has slightly different study habits. I know from my personal experience, I kind of did my own self-review course for the MCAT where I kind of picked up a few books and just kind of went at it myself. Looking back and having taken other standardized tests, I don't think that was the best route. I usually try to recommend some kind of test prep or at least some type of schedule spelled out on how to study for this massive of a test. But in general, do you have recommendations for people that are starting to consider the best means for them to study?
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of ways that students can approach the MCAT. And the most common ways, of course, would be self-studying for the exam like you did yourself, taking a test prep course, or looking for private tutoring. Now, regardless of which path you choose to take, there are three things that I recommend that all students do if they want to succeed on the MCAT. And that is, number one, they need to do content review. And we've already emphasized this with a bit that the MCAT tests all these different subjects. So taking the courses in a way is learning the content. But an important thing to understand is that by the time you take the MCAT, it's probably been a few years since you've taken a lot of those courses. So you're likely to have forgotten a lot of the material. A second important aspect is that the college courses that you take, even though they might be a general chemistry class, the curriculum of that general chemistry class is not going to perfectly align with the MCAT. So what that means is in your college courses, you're definitely going to be learning content that isn't tested on the exam, and vice versa. There's content tested on the exam that you didn't learn in your course. So it's really important for students to be able to pick up a set of MCAT review books where the content is focused specifically on the MCAT exam and really use that set of books to review content. Now, of course, the content could also be taken in other ways aside from a set of MCAT books. They can take a test prep course where the content is taught to them. They can also try to use online MCAT videos, and a great source out there is the Khan Academy videos, which a lot of students do use. The second thing that I recommend for students to do beyond content review is to do practice questions, practice passages, and full-length practice tests. And this is really important because the MCAT is actually very different from the other pre-health exams, the DAT, OAT, PCAT, and so forth. And that for all those other exams on the science sections, the questions are all freestanding questions, which means they're not associated with a passage. And when you have only freestanding questions, that means all the questions is really just testing the student's ability to memorize and essentially just spew out all these scientific facts. But on the MCAT, it's very different in that the vast majority of the questions are associated with a passage, and the passage is going to introduce new situations and new information that the student has never learned about before. And in order to answer those questions, students need to apply their knowledge of science to passage information to figure out the answer. And the only way to really improve on that is by doing practice questions. It's also really important to do an intensive review of the practice questions. So a lot of students will do practice questions, they'll look at the solutions, and they'll move on. But if students really want to be able to improve their scores, they need to do a more in-depth analysis. When they do their practice questions, they need to review them very thoroughly and really ask themselves, why did I get this question wrong? And what do I need to do so I don't get this question wrong again? So making sure that the student actually has an action plan in order to improve their scores. So that way they're not just doing a whole bunch of practice questions and getting the same scores over and over again.
Yeah, that is such a great point. And talking about how you learn the content and you've learned a lot of the material, but really with the exam, the whole art of this exam is applying that knowledge to different scenarios. And that is so reflective of the USMLEs or the licensing exams that you'll take in medical school as well, or the COMLEX exams that you'll take in osteopathic schools. And so the MCAT is really just setting that foundation of kind of standardized test ability in order to take all of this wealth of information you've learned through undergrad or through medical school and be able to apply it to these complex situations that they give you in these test prompts. And I totally agree with you, Ken, and I can't emphasize this enough about when you're actually going through these questions, don't just take the questions to see how you're doing and making an assessment of your progress, which is an important part as well, but you really want to learn from each question that you're taking. And this was a big mistake that I fell into, is that I would get caught up in, let me just do the practice tests. If I got a score that was acceptable to me, I'd move on and I wouldn't review the questions. And that's a waste of time. You want to use it to assess your progress, but really the learning comes when you review each question and even try to figure out, like you said, how did you miss the wrong ones, but how did you get the right ones right? And reviewing that content will just slowly enable you to apply it to further situations and just really solidify your knowledge in that area. So I think that's a great point. Definitely, everyone, we will be talking more about the MCAT and talking a little bit more in depth about the individual sections in the future. But this was just kind of a general overview of it and things to start thinking about. Ken, do you have any last thoughts for anybody that may be 6 months to a year to taking the MCAT or just kind of looking into it and trying to figure out, what they need to start thinking about and how they should start preparing?
Yeah. So I'd say, first of all, it's great that, they're looking ahead so far in the future, because I would say for most students that we work with, that's often not the case. So first of all, props to them already. In terms of what I think they should really think about is the timing of their schedule, really making sure that they have dedicated time that they can spend specifically for MCAT studies. And not just because we touched on this earlier, and that is there's so many students who, as pre-medical students, they're used to doing so many things at the same time. And they kind of just say, oh, I'm going to go ahead and take the exam in May. And gradually, as life happens, their spring semester just gets crammed with more and more courses, extracurricular activities, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So my recommendation is really for these students to choose a chunk of time that they want to be able to use for their MCAT studies and really try to leave it as open as possible.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's absolutely awesome. And I think part of doing well on the MCAT is just having a plan and planning early, planning for when you're going to take the test, looking at the website to see when that test date registration opens, and making sure you try to reserve a test date as soon as possible. And then just trying to plan as much as you can. As you said, life happens, but plan as much as you can for taking that test and setting your schedule around it. That's great. Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us today.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.